she actually walks outside of the church and calls to him sweetly. He finally turns around, looks at her, because he didn't even look at her the first time. He just glanced and ran. And she begins to kind of speak to him in a loving manner, and she comes and he kind of suckers him into the church once again. They have this conversation, and it becomes a regular occurrence for him that every time he went to the church, or almost every time, he'd get to experience the saints, specifically Saint Paraskevi and many others. Okay. When we hear the word church, it's a loaded word. A lot of us have different experiences when we come to church. Some of us have beautiful memories of beautiful liturgies and laughs and good times with our family members and loved ones. Other people might have the opposite feeling, where they hear the word church and all they remember is pain, suffering, tears, gossips, lies, name it, Sometimes this experience is had in the same exact church, where one person is on one end of the spectrum and another person's on the total end, but it's the same exact church. And finally, we can even say that some people experience both experiences, both polarizing feelings, where they feel at home at the church but also estranged from the church. I know I'm a little soft-spoken. You guys can hear me, right? Not really? Okay, is this better? Okay, yeah. Let me know if you still can't hear me. But a lot of us might even have that same experience where we feel very polarized. So, with this two views, it's easy for us to come to the conclusion and say that the church is not necessarily the building, but it's the people, right? The people we spend time with, that is the church. So why is it that we have this mixed feeling when we come to see the people or the church? Well, it gets very clear is that people are broken, right? When we look deep into our own hearts, we try to sense the hesitancy we have coming to church. And that hesitancy we can blame on the brokenness, right? But the church has a remedy for this. He sees the brokenness in each of us. So the church, in her motherhood, provides imagery of, if we look to my left, but you guys is right, the icon of the crucifix. And in at least the Eastern Church and the Western Church, they have the crucifix all the way at the front. But in our church, you might see it on every single wall in some way, shape, or form. And this crucifix shows a mangled body, broken. When Christ had become man, he has a habitual process where everything he touches, he sanctifies. Everything he touches, he sanctifies. So when he touches the human body, he sanctifies the human body. When he touches the mind, he sanctifies the mind, the thought, the human emotion. He even sanctifies the brokenness. Okay? But he says the church is broken, yes. But it's by our brokenness that I bring goodness, holiness, and healing through it. That is what he means by sanctifying the brokenness. It's through our brokenness he brings our salvation. Okay, but there's a big but in this situation, is for us to be a part of this salvation is to bring our brokenness into the church. Meaning we need to buy into the church, buy into each other's brokenness. We have to be okay with dealing with each other's messiness. I'll tell another story. So same guy, Saint Ikovos, this guy right here. When he was a child, he of course was impoverished, but he lived impoverished all the way through his mid-20s. he happened to work for his family and spend all of his money to feed mostly his sister and his family members that were still alive at the time. So unfortunately, he couldn't afford shoes. And we've already established now that he had bought in to the church. He was a chanter. This was before he had become a priest. So he was a deacon, just like you see us men over on this side. And he would stand at the podium and he would chant, but he would do it barefoot. He would walk everywhere barefoot, whether it be work or home or running to do errands, buy groceries. He just didn't have shoes. So as he was chanting, you can see that majority of the people would see him without shoes, and I'm sure a lot of us would be like, that's disgusting. Right? You have your dogs out, man, put those away. No one wants to see that. So a lot of ridicule started to come his way. So much so that every time he stepped into the church, they would put him down for not being able to have or come before the sacrifice of our Lord in shoes. So they put him down. He's human, so he felt this brokenness of the church, and he went and took it to prayer. So he went home and he spent hours praying before our Lord. After he was praying, and at the time, the name of this parish that he was attending was named after St. George. So as he's praying, and then he gets tuckered out, and then he collapses, you can imagine. Now, St. George had ended up appearing to him right at the end of his prayer. And he reads off, "My child, I don't want you to leave. I want you to keep chanting in my house as you are." I'll repeat that. "My child, I don't want you to leave. I want you to keep chanting in my house as you are." So it's interesting. Why is it that even the saints are trying to draw us into the church, right? It's almost as if they're telling us, bear your brother's brokenness. We're all here today because we have bought into Christ, at the very least, right? We see Christ and we know that we are loved by him. But there's a association that Christ tries to make. When our children and the people we serve and our families, they ask us, the question is, how can we experience God? How can we see God? I come to church, I want to see God. And when we attend the liturgy, there's an ascent that's happening during the liturgy. So usually the answer we'll give people is, you must ascend to God, right? To see God. Once we go to heaven, we'll be able to see him, experience him, feel him. But our Lord does not want to be encountered in that way while here on earth. At least not as often in that way. For the majority, his preference is for us to descend. Abuna Thomas was telling us something so beautiful. He said, our Lord was found at our feet, washing our feet. As scholars and our fathers, the monastic fathers, tell us, is that the Jewish tradition had the expectation that the Messiah would come championing on a horse, a warlord. But now he's before us, washing our feet. We must descend to find Christ. Christ is found down at our feet as a beggar, as Abuna would tell us. Christ is cloaked in the brokenness and the poverty of our brother. Christ is cloaked in the brokenness and poverty of our brother. This gentleman is named Elder Sophrony. He was actually recently canonized as a saint. And he says something very, very beautiful. He says the phrase, don't focus or ask why people are broken, but focus on how much people are broken. How much people are broken. I bow not only to all Christians, but I bow to all people. And I emphasize this last part. I bow to all people. Elder Sophrony through his phrase here, is embodying exactly this concept, is that he wants us to inherit the spirit and posture of a servant. When we come to church, our expectation is to be served, right, to be filled. But our Lord is trying to reorient that in a small twinge and say that you will be filled. But to be filled is to fill others, is to serve others, is to be at their feet, to accept their messiness, their brokenness. Okay. I know you guys know this guy. Bunike talks about him often. Elder Paisios of Mount Athos, one of the mega saints. He's, you can imagine, is like a Pope Krolos type figure, Baba Krolos. Many miracles, had gift of clairvoyance, you name it. There was this one time where some pilgrims had come on a pilgrimage to come visit him, and they had sat with him. One in particular was a young man in his 20s who was filled with a lot of angst, anxiety. So he sat with Elder Paisios. The night before, Elder Paisios had done vigil, so he was doing multiple matanyas and prostrations and prayers and staying up all night. It was a cold day, so this man comes and sits, and they sit on a slab of wood, and he begins to dump all of, you hear the word trauma dump. He's trauma dumping on Elder Paisios. 1 hour passes, 3 hours passes, 5 hours passes. About 8.5 hours in to this young man telling him about his life story and telling him about all his pains and his sorrows and his angst. Elder Paisios tries his best to give him a word or two of comfort and encouragement, but the man is not listening. All he's thinking about is the next thing he's going to say. So Elder Paisios realized that at this point, if he were to shift in his chair, if he were to make a different posture or show his fatigue or his tiredness, that the man would catch on, and the 8.5 hours that he spent listening to him would have a complete waste. So he stuck it in. He bore it. 9.5 hours in, the young man is finally comforted, and he leaves. Elder Paisios, you can imagine, hasn't eaten a thing for God knows how many days at that point, hasn't slept for over 24 hours, is in extreme fatigue, and we can imagine the picture, right? I tell this story not because it's, of course we like the miracle stories, but it's in these small acts of laying down our life. Is that where we truly encounter Christ ourselves? And by encountering him, we become a part of his body. And glory be to God forever and ever. Amen. You missed the sock store, man. Yeah, you wouldn't want me to answer questions anyways.